All right. Thanks everyone for joining today. Welcome to today's webinar, the Introduction to American Bird Conservancy's State Legislative Guide. We'll drop a link in the chat for the copy of the State Legislative Guide. This is a document that was created by ABC's Advocacy and Threats team, providing guidance on what looks like good bird-friendly legislation at the state level. Before we get started with today's presentation, I just wanted to make a few housekeeping notes so that we're all on the same page. This webinar will be recorded. For instructions about captioning for the event today, please see the chat, which is below you. We encourage you all to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We'll have a whole Q&A section at the very end when everyone has finished presenting. If for some reason we don't get to your question, we will try to get back to you, so we appreciate your understanding. I am your host for today, as well as one of the presenters. My name is Annie Chester. I'm ABC's Policy Director. I focus on migratory bird and seabird issues. I cover an array of topics from red knot conservation to plastic pollution mitigation and federal funding for migratory bird conservation. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit later about plastics legislation, but for now, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about this webinar and kind of webinars in the future. So this webinar is the first in a series of webinars that the American Bird Conservancy's advocacy and threats teams will be hosting around policy issues. Future webinars, we hope to dive deeper into specific policy topics that impact birds at the federal, state, and local levels. So be sure to look out for future announcements. I recommend, if you want to get those announcements, subscribing to our Bird Conservation Alliance newsletter. Check the chat. There will be a link in there to sign up for the newsletter. So before I introduce the rest of today's great speakers, I want to talk a little bit about why bird conservation policy is so important. So let me just switch my slide here. The problem, why do we care about bird conservation? Why is it important right now? Well, birds are in decline. Since the 1970s, about 3 billion birds have vanished from the US and Canada. That's a pretty staggering statistic. That's 1 in 4 birds. And we're really seeing declines across so many habitats. So states play an important role in conserving birds and making sure that those habitats are protected. So this is also an important part, is that states are part of the solution because the federal government and state governments share powers. Policy making is really a process that helps communities address challenges and create solutions. States are really uniquely positioned to understand local issues better than the federal government, so it's really important for states to be part of policy change and policy that helps birds. So today's speakers are going to talk to you about a range of topics. We're going to start the presentations today by hearing from Grant Sizemore, who is the Director of Invasive Species Programs at American Bird Conservancy. As part of his work, Grant works to reduce harms to birds by invasive species. He runs the Cat Indoors program, which advocates for responsible cat ownership and effective unowned cat management solutions that benefit cats, birds, and people. After Grant, we'll hear from Caitlin Parkins, who is ABC's Glass Collisions Program Coordinator. She works to reduce bird window collisions through education, outreach, glass testing, and policy solutions. After Caitlin, we'll hear from Hardy Kern, who is Director of Government Relations for ABC's Pesticides and Birds campaign. Hardy works to find policy solution for threats to birds stemming from toxic chemicals and environmental contaminants. After Hardy, I will talk next about plastic legislation, and then we'll hear from Lewis Grove, who is the Director of Wind Energy Policy at ABC. Lewis advocates for bird smart energy development to minimize risk to bird populations posed by energy development and climate change. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to Grant.
Thank you, Annie. And hello, everyone. All right, hopefully you can see my presentation. I want to say thank you very much for participating today. I have just lost my slide, my thing. There we go. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for joining. I have the pleasure of speaking with you today about cats. And how they fit into our state legislative action. Cats are a really interesting and complex challenge that affects not only birds, but also a whole host of other wildlife, human health, a bunch of different things. And we're going to talk about that today. And I hope by the end of this that all of you can become advocates for our cats indoors work. So, like I said, so the Cats Indoors program, the Cats issue, really involves a whole bunch of different components. We most commonly think about cats as predators in the environment, or perhaps most commonly think of them as cuddly, cute companions. But then, from an environmental perspective, a conservation perspective, certainly they are predators in the environment, and so there are risks to wildlife, birds, and other wildlife associated with their presence in the environment. There are nuisances associated with them roaming outdoors. There are disease threats. There are risks to the cats themselves. And there are animal welfare concerns associated with this also. So we're going to delve into just a few of these today, briefly. And then, of course, as we move forward, happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session or as they pop up in the chat. So cats are the top source of direct human-caused bird mortality in the United States. They kill an estimated 2.4 billion birds every single year. Um, they are the elephant in the room when it comes to bird conservation, and really conservation generally, but definitely with regard to bird conservation, we cannot, if we're not going to get serious about cats, we're not going to get serious about bird conservation. We have to address the cat issue. And I do want to point out that these numbers are from 2015. Some of them, especially I know the building windows number, have increased a little bit. But still, cats are far and away the number one source of direct human-caused bird mortality. We have to address this issue if we're going to get serious about conserving birds. And cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species around the world, birds, mammals, and reptiles. So, this mortality adds up. It affects populations, it affects species. And so we are seeing declines in threatened and endangered species associated with cats roaming the environment, killing those birds directly. We've seen species level extinctions. Cats can wipe out entire populations incredibly quickly in a couple of years only. And all of this adds up to a recognition by international organizations that cats are among the world's most harmful invasive species globally. Now, they also are a vector for the spread of a variety of parasites and diseases, many of which are zoonotic, can be spread to people. There are a lot of them. I'm going to just touch on two of those, rabies and toxoplasmosis. So cats are the top carrier of rabies among domestic animals in the United States. So it's no longer Old Yeller, it's now Old Tigger, or something like that. And what we see is, in particular in the eastern United States, where there is the raccoon rabies virus variant, where it's endemic and spreading, there is a large number of cats that test positive for rabies every year. And of course, that requires a lot of resources from state and local governments in terms of monitoring, surveillance, and then addressing potential exposures with people who might come into contact with unknown cats whose rabies vaccination status is unknown. And you have to get a post-exposure prophylaxis, a series of shots after you've been exposed to a cat who may have rabies. That is not fun, and it's expensive for the individual as well. As you probably know, rabies is nearly 100% fatal. We want to do everything we can to prevent the transmission. And of course, we want to be diligent on addressing those potential exposures when they do happen. But the best course of action is to prevent those exposures to begin with. And when cats are roaming in the environment, they are coming into contact with those rabies vectors like raccoons, like skunks, and then serve as a pathway for transmission to people. They disproportionately expose more people to that disease than wildlife. The other disease, toxoplasmosis, is caused by infection with the parasite Toxoplasma gondii. This is a tiny little parasite that relies on felines to complete its life cycle. It can only complete its life cycle in the gut of a feline. And so domestic cats will excrete little infectious eggs called oocysts into the environment. A single cat can excrete up to hundreds of millions of these little oocysts that remain infectious for months to years in soil, freshwater, marine systems, and can subsequently infect any bird or mammal, any warm-blooded species. It is a really fascinating little parasite. It's sort of a zombie parasite, which I'm not going to talk about today. But there are a lot of great reasons why we do not want to have this parasite in the environment. It can affect livestock, it can affect wildlife, including game species, and it can affect people. And this is the reason that OBs tell pregnant women not to change cat litter while they're pregnant, because of the risks to the fetus. It can cause miscarriages, it can cause fetal deformities, it can cause blindness, it can cause organ failure, up to and including death. And it is particularly problematic for those with compromised immune systems. It is also the second leading cause of death among foodborne illnesses in the United States. So we really do not want to have it running amok in our agricultural system. So if you're aware, barn cats, they are a risk, a very serious risk for the transmission of Toxoplasma gondii into that agricultural system, potentially leading to livestock and human exposures. So really the takeaway message here with regard to our work on cats is cats are great pets. I've got a cat myself. I cats most of my life, but they cause significant harm when they're out in the environment. So we have to manage cats. So the Cats Indoors program is dedicated to that management. And what does effective management look like? So it includes essentially treating cats like we treat dogs. We want cats to be kept under an owner's control on a leash in a catio. We want them to be sterilized. We want them to be vaccinated for rabies. We really want them to be contained. So cats indoors, as the name suggests. It is consistent with recommendations by the American Veterinary Medical Association, which recognizes the harms to cats, to wildlife, to people, to the environment generally when cats roam outdoors. They recommend that cats be kept indoors. And if we want to manage populations of cats, we are experiencing a cat overpopulation crisis in the United States. We really have to turn off the tap. We have to get control of the owned cat population, because without doing that, we're never going to reduce the numbers of cats that are roaming the environment. So keeping cats indoors, sterilizing, microchipping, and getting them vaccinated are all great strategies. And these have been adopted in various iterations across the United States. You can see some of those policies at the state and local level in this table here on the left. I also want to highlight this toolkit on the right, produced by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which represents the state fish and wildlife agencies across the United States. It's got a lot of great information on some of the background, the wildlife concerns. But I think for state and local legislators, it's particularly interesting in the components that it provides for case law, for regulations for agencies, for public policy. I think it is a great resource. I recommend you checking it out. It is available on our website, and I will put that link in the chat here in just a little bit. So I think that's all the time I have for today. As I mentioned, I will be around in case you have any questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Grant. And now we will turn it to Caitlin.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Let's go here. All right, so thanks so much. My name is Caitlin Parkins, and I'm going to be speaking today about collisions and also a little bit on light, which are two related issues for birds. So window collisions kill over 1 billion birds every single year in the US alone. And this number seems to be increasing in part due to continued development, architectural trends of wanting, tons of windows, tons of natural light, and using lots of glass. The collision victims tend to be migratory songbirds, though there is a massive list. Almost every species out there has hit a window at one point or another. But these migratory songbirds kind of run the gamut of North America twice every single year during migration. And during that time, they're moving through our developed areas, areas that they're not particularly familiar with. So these are not common or nuisance species. And as you can see here in the photo pictured, this is a layout of collision victims. This is only a small portion of the carcasses collected from a single monitoring program in a single season. And birds don't hit glass because they're stupid. They hit glass because they see habitat reflected in it or behind it and fly towards that habitat. For example, on these buildings, we can use architectural cues to recognize this. This is trees behind a building, behind glass in an atrium, or trees reflected in glass. Birds, however, don't understand architecture. They don't see mullions, they don't see door handles, they don't see signage, and they take this literally, and they don't perceive this glass as a solid barrier. And of course, unlike when humans run into glass, it's mostly just our egos that are injured. Birds, on the other hand, they hit glass at high speeds and they often die instantly or sustain serious injuries from which they often do not recover. Now, there tends to be a tendency to associate collisions with cities and skyscrapers and think that this is not a rural issue or a suburban issue. But in fact, 56% of all collisions, the majority, take place at mid-rise buildings. So this is from 3 to about 11 stories. 44%, which is almost all the remaining collisions, take place at homes 1 to 3 stories, and only a tiny fraction of 1% actually occurs at skyscrapers. And even at skyscrapers in cities, most collisions happen on the lower floors. So there's really an opportunity here to address this issue every single place that buildings are located, because anywhere that birds are located and buildings are located in close proximity, there is a risk of collisions. Fortunately, the collisions issue is one that we know how to solve. At ABC, part of our work is on finding solutions to prevent collisions, including through testing bird-friendly glass at our testing tunnel facilities in the eastern US. We use a flight tunnel here. We test wild caught birds. They fly towards different patterns, different types of glass at the end of this tunnel, and we can use that to determine whether that information to determine whether the material we're testing is bird-friendly. Of course, there is a net at the end, so the birds do not strike the glass and they are released from this tunnel unharmed to carry on their way. And through this research and other research, there's been an incredible influx in the development of bird-friendly glass and other materials. So there are tons of options available. And as more companies get involved in this space, competition continues to increase, prices continue to decrease, and there's just so much opportunity here and so many different materials available. Including the things listed here, exterior screens, different types of glass with patterns on it, all of these things that both preserve the amount of light that's coming into buildings, preserve great views, they're really unobtrusive to humans, and they protect birds. And our goal now is to encourage the adoption of these materials, both on existing buildings and future construction. A great example of the adoption of bird-friendly materials is the Milwaukee Bucks Stadium. This is the first bird-friendly stadium that a coalition, including ABC, worked towards for a few years before this stadium was built. But it has set an example and sort of a new bar for stadiums, and we're seeing a lot of interest in some of the new ones in incorporating bird-friendly materials as well. Of course, the best way to prevent more bird-killing buildings from being built is not to go one by one, but to address it legislatively. So far, 27 municipalities have passed legislation that requires new buildings to be bird-friendly. That includes 5 states at this point, and there are also guidelines for new federal buildings as well. And in order to be successful, these policies need to define a few things. So what structures are covered, how much of each structure must be bird-friendly, and how is bird-friendly defined? And we have guidance for all of these questions to help form a policy that works for your community. Many of these pieces of legislation have common goals to reduce the amount and exposure of glass, to maximize bird-friendly glass and other bird-friendly materials. They focus on the lower floors where most collisions happen, and they often include renovations that replace glass. So if a building's being renovated, it's a great opportunity to put bird-friendly glass in the place of existing glass. Just some examples of current legislation. NYC is really the gold standard. This was implemented in 2021, and it requires all new construction to be bird friendly to 75 feet and includes any glass that's adjacent to green roofs or other areas where birds could possibly be attracted. And it does apply to all new construction. Illinois, as an example of state legislation, requires new and renovated state-owned buildings to use bird-friendly glass on 90% of the building to 40 feet, and that's where most collisions occur, and 60% of the glass above 40 feet. Wisconsin, on the other hand, their requirements apply to new and renovated state-owned buildings that have more than 20% of glass in their facades. So buildings with less glass need not apply. And they require bird-friendly strategies on 80% of the facade up to 2 stories or the tree canopy, whichever is higher. So as you can imagine, this patchwork of requirements can be difficult for architects to navigate. So we're working on helping guide communities towards similar standards that best protect birds and support community development and make it easier for everyone to navigate. And I just want to mention that light is a related issue for birds. Not only does light affect all wildlife and humans, bright lights can increase the number of collisions at a window, and bright lights like spotlights, pictured here as the 9/11 Memorial Tribute in Light, can actually attract and disorient birds to the extent that they circle in those lights to exhaustion. And so we have guidelines in our state legislative guide for reducing light pollution in your community as well, and some other resources available there. And that is it for me for now, and I'll be here at the end to answer questions.
Thanks, Caitlin. That was great. And now we will turn it to Hardy.
All righty. Can you see the Western Meadowlark that we have up there?
Looks great.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And even though I work for ABC and I work with all of these cool indoor cats, I always get really excited just to hear about the things that we have going on and the resources that we have available for everyone. So I'm here to talk a little bit about pesticides and how they impact birds, and then what we have in the state legislative guide to help shape policy or provide some framework around ameliorating some of that. In the State of the Birds report in 2023, and even for a couple prior to that, the use of chemicals has been listed as a cause of bird mortality. This has been repeated in a bunch of different studies. So the 2.7 million number that we might be familiar with from State of the Birds is a really, really drastic under-evaluation and underestimate of what that number probably is. There are other papers that have suggested it's somewhere between 67 and 72 million birds per year. But the thing to keep in mind is that's only estimates based on a bird ingesting a toxic pesticide and then directly experiencing mortality from it. There's a lot of other things that factor into it. And like Annie said at the top of the program today, we are experiencing a massive decline in birds in North America. But some of the species, some of the larger groups of species that are most affected are birds that depend on other parts of their ecosystems really heavily. Specifically, birds that require insects as part of their diet or as important pollinators in their habitat. So the group that includes aerial insectivores such as swifts and swallows and flycatchers has seen about a 32% reduction in that same period of time. And birds that live in grasslands that really heavily feed on insects and insect larvae saw about a 53% decline as well. And in that time period that was examined, about 50 years, Greg Tallamy and Doug Shriver, two fantastic scientists, did another analysis of all the birds looked at to determine that 2.9 billion bird decline. And they found that when you looked at it by what the birds ate, somewhere around 96% of all terrestrial birds in the United States eat insects at some point in their life. This includes hummingbirds that eat nectar. When their babies are young, they actually feed them a lot of spiders and other flies. This might include small birds like kestrels that eat a lot of grasshoppers and crickets and things like that. And when they looked at that same data set that said we're experiencing a 2.9 billion bird decline, they found that one of the most defining characteristics was that birds for whom insects were essential, those were the ones that were really experiencing a big population fall. Birds where insects were not necessarily essential, such as those that eat a lot of fish, they might have seen a little bit of a population bump in that same period of time. And one of the big things that you might hear about in the news a lot when we talk about chemical pesticides are specific chemicals called neonicotinoid insecticides, or neonics. Neonics came on the scene in the mid 90s and their use exploded, as you can see from this graph on the right around 2008. That's when we started to see them really be used kind of hand over fist year after year. And that's because these insecticides, in addition to being applied to lawns and sprayed onto large agricultural crops, started to be used as a seed coating, where they're actually put on the outside of a seed before it goes into the ground. This is a great delivery system for these chemicals into the soil, but unfortunately, the nature of these neonic chemicals means that they very easily travel off and away from the seed. They get into waterways, they come off as dust while they're being planted, where they might impact insects, where they can have an impact on non-target bugs, so the things that aren't destroying agricultural crops. And on top of that, if a bird comes down and eats a seed coated in a neonicotinoid, a single seed is toxic enough to cause mortality. If they eat just a fraction of one or they're exposed to a little bit, it can cause everything from the inability to fly to massive weight loss while they're trying to migrate when they really need to pack on those ounces. So it can be really devastating, not just from directly eating them, but from decreasing their prey. And going past neonic insecticides, another large group of chemicals that impacts birds are rodenticides, chemicals that we use to try to reduce mouse and rat and other vermin populations in urban areas. And I was lucky enough to have an intern named Round Clithermes who looked at all of the data that the EPA released from a period of 2013 to 2023. Every time that there was a confirmed wildlife incident stemming from pesticide use, and as you can see here, the number of incidents that stemmed from birds was way above any other group of wildlife that was examined from that incident database release. So we know from looking at these that most of these are from rodenticides as well, where a mouse or a rat might wander away and get eaten by a hawk or an eagle or a falcon or a vulture, and then start to suffer from those chemicals as well. So in our state legislative guide, we have a few different strategies of how you can start to think about policy at the state level, things that you can do. And there's three sort of general types of laws that we tend to see springing up across the US that are excellent at addressing the threats from chemical pesticides to birds and other wildlife. And they are one, the authority to regulate. So in some cases, a state department of agriculture or a state department of the environment may want to enact their own set of rules or regulations, their own prohibitions, their own guidelines, but they might need written permission from the legislature in order to develop those guidelines. So we see legislation authorizing that. We see some making certain chemicals restricted use status, which means that you need to be a licensed, certified pesticide applicator in order to access those chemicals. This is a great way to ensure that people can't go to the hardware store and have access to them where they can be applied in huge amounts, but instead people that have training in how to apply these chemicals are the only ones with access to them. And then there's my personal favorite, which is prohibition on certain uses of these chemicals. We've seen things such as timelines on phasing out certain types of chemicals. We've seen certain crops say, we would like you to stop using these as seed coatings by a certain year. There have even been some that say, you can't use a second generation anticoagulant rodenticide in a public space such as a park or a soccer field or around a school. So there's really different or really effective different types of legislation that we've seen be successful. And one thing with chemicals that I do think is important to point out is that the really successful legislation, the stuff that sticks, the stuff that tends to get the most public support from across a broad range of interests, are ones that have important carve outs. Things that say we're going to prohibit or restrict the use of these chemicals, but we want to make sure that trained professionals have access to them in case that there's an emerging pathogen or disease, in case there's a new invasive species that comes up, or with the case of seed treatments, if the market doesn't provide anything for the growers to access, it's important to make sure that your bases are covered, and we have information on that in the guide as well. So we've got this kind of weird but fantastic patchwork of different laws that we've seen pop up. There's 12 across the US that fully make neonics restricted or restricted use in some way. And then two of my favorites are that New York and Vermont have fabulous laws asking for the prohibition of neonic coated seeds starting in 2029. So it gives everybody plenty of time for the marketplace to adjust. And when it comes to chemical pesticides, even though it can be a little complicated and seems somewhat insurmountable, every action and every acre counts. Every step that you can take towards reducing the threat of toxic chemicals to wildlife is really important and really helpful. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thanks so much, Hardy. And I am actually up next, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can we see that okay?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
So I will be talking about plastic pollution specifically and how states can help in addressing that. So just to start off, there's a lot of plastic that ends up in the environment. About 17 billion pounds of plastic enters the ocean annually. Plastic that ends up in the ocean is coming from inland sources. So it can come from your state that has a river system that goes into the ocean. It can come in a variety of different ways. And the issue is once plastics enter the environment, they take a really long time to biodegrade. Depending on the plastic item, it can take 10 to 500 years, which is a widely variable time frame. For birds, especially seabirds that are interacting with marine ecosystems, 90% of those birds have ingested some form of plastic. And this is a problem that I'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. But I also just wanted to highlight that plastics come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. So you have macroplastics, which are big pieces of plastic. So think, a single-use reusable water, or sorry, single-use water bottle. And then you have microplastics, which could be, a piece of paint that has chipped off your wall that you can visually see. There's also plastics that are so small they take a microscope to see. So those would be the nanoplastics. And all of these plastics can pose different threats to birds as well as human communities. So as I want to point out, plastics can come from a variety of places. So they can come from everything from sewage discharge to tourism. And the ways they enter the food system are through the marine ecosystem and rivers especially. So with birds, they are ingesting plastics in a variety of ways. Adults that are feeding their chicks are potentially regurgitating plastics. Birds eating contaminated prey. So, for example, a fish may have ingested a microplastic, and then a bird ingests that fish that contains that microplastic. So that is a way that the bird is then impacted by plastic. The other really interesting way that birds eat plastic is by mistaking it for food. So algae can grow atop plastic, and that scent attracts certain birds, such as albatross. And ingesting plastic is not good. I think there has been increasing research on how plastics can impact humans, and there is current and growing research on how it impacts birds. So Physical impairment is one way it impacts birds. Something I didn't mention, a micro or a macroplastic that is a risk for birds is discarded fishing gear, and that type of plastic can entangle birds and result in drowning and injury. Birds also, when they ingest plastic, that can block their digestive tract, that can cause permanent injury to the digestive tract. And then the toxicological effects of plastic can really harm birds by affecting their reproduction, again, their digestive function, causing a lot of excess inflammation. So, not good news for birds. So, in terms of thinking about this, solutions at a state level, there is many ways states can approach this, and different states are going to have different solutions. So, some states have existing preemption, so prohibitions on regulating plastics. So, in some states, just addressing that and making sure that they are able to regulate plastics is a first step. Other states, we have coastal states, we have inland states. So a coastal state might have a big visible issue of marine debris on their beaches, and maybe that is a really important area that they address. Whereas an inland state might have plastic pellets, so small pieces of plastics in their rivers. So addressing the point source pollution of those pellets might be the thing that is most important to address. Again, in terms of existing plastic laws, maybe there's opportunities for your state to, for example, adopt another single-use ban. So maybe your state has adopted a single-use plastic bottle ban. Well, maybe there's an opportunity to also adopt a bag ban. The other thing I want to point out is with plastics, you have upstream solutions and you have downstream solutions. Upstream, you are addressing plastic before it enters the environment. So, for example, with plastic pellets, you're making sure that they're not being discharged into waterways. Whereas downstream solutions are when those pellets are already in the water and you need to initiate some type of cleanup of those pellets. So, again, already states are taking action on plastics, which is great for birds, great for people. I want to highlight a few examples of different things states are doing, and I'll start just with Virginia. So Virginia banned single-use polystyrene foam cups and takeout containers in 2021. This phase-out would have gone into effect in 2023, but due to language that was added to the budget, this phase-out has been delayed to 2025. And now we're seeing renewed attempts to further delay the phase-out of foam cups and takeout containers. So I like to highlight this example because obviously it's really great Virginia banned these single-use products that are not good for birds and often end up as pollution in the environment. However, even when your state passes a ban or some types of plastic legislation, there can sometimes be more work to do. So in the case of Virginia, advocates are really working hard to make sure that the 2020 or 2023 phase out does go into effect. Another state that I want to point out is Washington State. They passed a bill that addressed multiple plastic issues. So a trifecta bill, as they called it. So it addressed single-use plastic bottle use, and basically the bill mandated that where water fountains are required, that water bottle filling stations also be installed. So this is a very simple way to address plastics and plastic bottles specifically, but it's a novel solution and is a way to help citizens and encourage them also to use reusable products. Michigan is another state I wanted to highlight. There is preemption on a plastic bag ban in Michigan. So a big initiative that advocates in Michigan are working towards is just making sure that they can introduce and pass legislation that allows them to ban plastic bags later down the line. Illinois is the final state I have listed here. Similar to Washington State, they have banned single-use personal care bottles in hotels. So, your shampoos, your soaps, those can't be in single-use plastics. So I want to leave you just with, kind of wrapping things up. When you're considering solutions to addressing plastic pollution, you really have to be mindful of what practices are best for birds and people. Especially, I think a lot of us growing up might have had an emphasis on recycling. And while recycling is important and is certainly a solution to plastic pollution, there might be better laws or bills that could be introduced that would really make more of an impact. So just thinking through what some of those solutions might be. And to the extent that's possible, upstream solutions are definitely preferable because you're addressing plastics before they enter the environment. That being said, plastics are already in the environment, so downstream solutions at this point in time are also needed. But again, wherever we can, thinking upstream is very important. So with that, I thank you for listening in, and I will call on Lewis to be our next presenter.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Annie. Can you see that?
Yes, looks great.
Awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lewis Grove, and I will echo my colleagues' appreciation for you all joining today. We really appreciate seeing you all. I'm going to be presenting some high-level information on our BirdSmart wind energy program. And in general, we're really interested in partnering with folks at the state level to expand this program in the coming years. So if you have any interest in learning more, please don't hesitate to reach out and follow up. At ABC, we believe that energy development can be a net positive for bird populations. With the right guardrails in place, we can balance our need for increased, inexpensive energy while still minimizing impacts to iconic American species like the bald eagle. Challenges posed by a changing climate require a changing electrical grid, but we cannot afford to ignore longstanding declines in avian populations and biodiversity as we chart a new energy path. We don't want to look back in a few decades and realize that the cost was not worth it. I often liken this to building dams in the early 20th century. We put in dams kind of all over the country and for good reasons, for flood control and power production in rural areas. But a more forward-thinking approach might have avoided the problems which have led to a lot of those dams being removed in the decades hence. So in that case, dams were built with public funds. They damaged public resources like wildlife, and then were required to be removed again with more public funds. So we can avoid that mistake by charting a better course on wind energy from the start. So why worry about wind turbines? You saw this chart in a different form earlier for Grant. I'm going to flip it on its head a bit. Turbines are at the bottom of this chart, absolutely. And so maybe it's easy to think this isn't a major concern for birds. And for a lot of species, it's not, just in terms of raw numbers. You can see cats have a much larger kill of birds in terms of raw numbers. But raw numbers are, of course, a bit simplistic. Cats don't tend to kill a lot of golden eagles, for instance, while we know that turbines do kill hundreds of golden eagles every year in the United States. And larger birds like eagles not only have lower populations to start with, but they take longer to reach sexual maturity and thus to recover from those losses that they do sustain. So while overall numbers of take from turbines might be lower, it can still form a significant enough proportion of a population for a set of species to have real significant impacts. So we encapsulate all of this within our 7 ABC BirdSmart Wind principles. These generalized principles can form the foundation for a net positive energy regulatory regime. And these are, I'll just read through them quick. The first 2 deal with siting. So comprehensive assessment, proactive to even building, right? Assessing sites ahead of time. And then putting them in low risk areas as you determine. We want transparency in construction monitoring of bird impacts. Those counts are usually secretive and not available to the public, but transparency is a key part of our environmental legal regime in America. Effective mitigation measures need to be implemented in construction and operation phases. And then on the back end, compensatory mitigation should be implemented for any unavoidable bird mortality and habitat loss. Upon decommissioning, we'd like to see a plan for habitat restoration for the removal of that infrastructure on the back end through bonds and various mechanisms. And then finally, wind energy should be evaluated as part of a comprehensive analysis of all the different alternative energy alternatives. So, as I mentioned, all these principles are important, but siting is the top one for the reason. If a project is sited in a high volume migration route or near a breeding colony of a sensitive species, it may just not be feasible to effectively mitigate take at all. This is ABC's wind risk assessment map. You can see here, this is available on our website. I'll put the link in the chat here in a bit. And it provides a color-coded, category-based reference to identify bird risks for a given site and to identify also any given potential conflict species. Red areas on this map are areas that we feel mitigation is essentially unfeasible. These are national parks, extremely high value natural areas where we think wind is probably not suited at all. Orange and yellower shades represent areas with some concerns, but where effective mitigation techniques could still create a net positive result for birds. Finally, the unshaded parts of the map are where we consider wind energy to pose the least threat to bird populations and where we might not recommend any substantial mitigation. So the principles are reflected within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's land-based wind energy guidelines. This document from 2012 contains voluntary guidance for wind energy developers to minimize their harms to wildlife and in doing so, reduce their own potential legal liability for unpermitted take. We strongly support the use of these guidelines as a basis for states to properly evaluate projects under a balanced regulatory regime. There's a tiered approach within there, which allows for flexibility and kind of a menu of options, mitigation options that balance public and private interests, and while providing a clear roadmap for rulemakings for agencies. From early stage desktop analysis all the way through construction and operational monitoring, there's just a wealth of information in here for methods of reducing conflict between energy development and birds. And currently, no states that we know have a requirement for bird smart wind, a permit for that. So we encourage states to incorporate this guidance or some subset of it into regulation through statute. Of course, that's easier said than done. One of the major challenges at the state level are the highly disparate processes for energy project permitting between states. Numerous states leave this entirely to local control. It has implications for state constitutional home rule issues. Others permit processes through a public utilities commission that may include vague or kind of broad generic environmental impact analyses language. And a few states and territories have no guardrails at all on energy development. So suffice to say, most states probably require a tailored approach. And I'll just also note, it's not wind, but we also really strongly support the development of photovoltaic solar energy on the already disturbed human environment. Solar energy on the built environment has the benefit of reducing pressures to develop undisturbed habitats elsewhere. It has the added benefit of producing electricity close to where it's consumed, which reduces the need for costly and hard to build transmission projects that have their own associated harms to wildlife. In many cases, incentivizing this kind of solar energy development is just a matter of cost parity. So we believe that states can play a powerful role in reducing energy development pressures on wildlife habitat through encouraging this kind of solar development. And that just has the added benefit of decreasing land use pressures of all kinds for housing and agriculture and all kinds of things. So thanks greatly for your time today. Don't hesitate to reach out and be in touch if you'd like to find out more about incentivizing bird smart wind energy development or rooftop solar energy in your state. I'll turn it back over to Annie.
Thanks, Louis. That was great. I will ask all the other presenters now to join us on video, and we'll do a quick Q&A session. So, if you haven't already submitted a question, now is the time using the Q&A box. Thanks to those of you who have already submitted questions. To kick it off, we'll just start in order of how we presented. So I see a question here about cats. Someone asks, how can we reduce feral cat colonies when there is so much pushback from local cat lovers and the proliferation of no-kill shelters? So, Grant, help us out here.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so it's a two-tiered response. I mean, first, we have to really focus on reducing the source population of those cats to begin with, and that really is responsible cat ownership. So we have to enact policies that incentivize and preferably enforce responsible cat ownership practices, things like identification, sterilization, and most importantly, containment, keeping cats on your property in a catio, on a leash, inside the house, just not running amok in the environment. We've already done this to a large degree with dogs, but we now need to do it with cats also. And then enforcing existing laws against abandonment. Cat colonies exist because people are abandoning their animals in the environment. We can also, so many communities have elected to enact feeding bans, so it doesn't concentrate cats in the environment where they cause nuisances for neighbors. I mean, who wants a cat colony in their backyard? If they want a cat colony in their backyard, let them have that and keep it on their property. It's one of the compromises I've been advocating for a little while here is if you want to maintain a cat colony, go ahead and do so in your backyard on private property with property owner consent and just keep them contained. It's a much better solution for the cats. It allows you to keep track of them, identify which ones are there, whether or not any of them need veterinary care, make sure that they're all sterilized, identified. It's better management for the cats. And of course, it's much better management for wildlife in the human community as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Grant. And someone also asked, do cats like being walked on a leash? So do you want to touch on that quickly?
Yeah, some cats do and some cats don't. It's of course a lot easier if you get a cat used to it when they are young. Um, but many cats will enjoy some outdoor time on a leash. Some will just plop down and, you know, lie there, and that's fine. The point is to give them some outdoor time if they want it. If they don't like being walked on a leash, there are a bunch of other solutions that you can use. Backpacks, strollers, a catio. So a catio, I keep mentioning, it's an enclosed cat patio. So cat patio, catio. It can be as basic as, you know, your existing sunroom. You can just put up some chicken wire, or you can make it really elaborate, fancy, spend a bunch of money on it. But it's just an outdoor space that keeps cats safe, keeps wildlife safe.
Yeah, definitely. My cat's a plopper, so other solutions are great too. The next question is for Caitlin. So someone was kind of asking about how birds perceive glass and, higher floors don't see as many collisions, and they're wondering, is that because it's only reflecting sky? But then why don't birds see an open flyway? So if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't really have time to explain it. So, birds tend to hit the lower floors of buildings for the same reason that people are most likely to be in a car accident close to home, because that's where they're most active. So, birds are going to be most active foraging, feeding, flying in the tree canopy, and that's where collisions are most likely to occur for that reason. That person's completely correct that higher levels, if they're reflecting sky, birds may still see that as an escape route and certainly try to fly to it. There are just fewer birds active the higher you go up on a building. And from a pragmatic standpoint and a cost benefit standpoint, it can be really cost prohibitive to, say, use bird friendly materials all the way up to 60 stories of a building. And so at a certain point, you are not saving as many birds as you go up, and it's not necessarily worth the increased cost if it might prevent someone from adopting the use of bird-friendly materials entirely. And so that's why we recommend focusing on those lower floors so we can save the most birds that we can while also having a reasonable ask.
Yeah, thanks for that. The next question I was gonna pose is for Hardy, regarding pesticides. I know you are always tracking a bunch of different things in different states. Can you talk a little bit about some of your work in a particular state that was particularly successful? So I know you've been tracking things in Vermont and elsewhere. So maybe just give a little bit more detail on one of those examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So Vermont is a really interesting case of how they started with sort of smaller actions at a state legislative level, particularly with neonicotinoid insecticides. So they initially asked that a set of best management practices be created within such and such a date. And that was something that they charged their Department of Agriculture and Department of the Environment with. That evolved into having neonicotinoids become restricted use in the state, meaning that only certified pesticide applicators were able to access them. And then early in 2024, they successfully passed legislation prohibiting the use of neonics as seed treatments beginning in 2029. And that effort was only successful because there was already more education and a lot more understanding that was done with those earlier bills. So it was a years long process, but it was important to go through all of those steps to get people and legislators on in Vermont on board with that effort. And what was interesting in Vermont's case as well is that even though the legislature passed it, the governor at the time actually decided to veto the bill. And then there was a veto override that got the bill to become law and become fully enacted. And that was a really good testament to all of the great work that was done by the legislators within their Senate and their Assembly to get them to understand these issues and why it mattered. And also, I think the other thing in Vermont that made it really successful was that far out timeline. I mean, from a purely bird and ecological perspective, I would have loved to see that phase away from pesticide coated seeds happen a little bit closer to 2024. But by having that timeline expanded out to 2029, it gives markets, providers, growers, everybody time to better understand the issue and adjust to what the law is eventually going to require that they do. So that was a really great success case of groups working together to educate legislators, a few great champions in their assembly, and then being able to work with the Senate in Vermont to get that one over the finish line. And we're seeing very similar processes in other states right now. Minnesota and potentially Colorado are also looking at doing things along a similar timeline.
Yeah, thanks for that example. Good example of how the legislative process is not always linear. And for the last question, we have 2 minutes here. I will turn to Lewis. So someone asked regarding wind power, is there any plans for curtailment? So stopping turbines when waves are forecast. So if you want to shed any light there quickly, that'd be great.
Yeah, curtailment is fantastically effective stuff. There's kind of two forms of it. There's this broad-based form that is when conditions are good or when wind speeds are at certain levels, that turbines can be curtailed and turned off, and that'll avoid a lot of the take. And then there are precision systems like AI cameras and such that will identify eagles as they move amongst turbines and can shut down individual turbines specifically to avoid those collisions. And those can produce really effective reductions in take, 60% or more in eagles. We get 95% or more in some species of vultures that are prone to collision. So they can be really effective. And the power loss is usually around 1, 2, 3%. So it can be really effective stuff. And I'll just step outside of birds for a second and say that bats are also a major concern with turbines, and curtailment regimes have proven to be even more effective for bats than birds. But all that is to say, there is not, as far as I know, any mandatory curtailment regimes in effect in America, except for a few under consent decrees under the Department of Justice. So
Thanks for that, Lewis. And if anyone has questions, we will be sending out an email. There will be ways for you to get in contact with us. So please look out for that. You'll also receive a recording of the webinar. So we're always happy to follow up. But thanks everyone so much for attending today's webinar. We really appreciate it. Have a good one.
Thanks all.